What is the best type of story? Is it a story that happened in the real world, or is it a story that has been fabricated? Fiction is easily the most common type of story. The idea of pure imagination being used as the structure of a world is not only fun from a creator's perspective, but also from the viewer's perspective. Fiction is also by far the most popular literary genre, as opposed to something that documents real thoughts or events. On television, prominent mainstream shows had been fictional for decades, until around the early 2000s when the rise of reality television had become equally as substantial. Despite how exaggerated and/or genuinely staged reality shows are most of the time, the point of them should be to portray reality as it is. But sometimes, the essence of reality in a story only exists to be parodied. So then why does it have to be one or the other? Like I mentioned before, the result of merging reality with fiction is often bland and meaningless, but if done intelligently, reality and fiction can thoughtfully coexist within a story. So how exactly is this the case? In this video, I have for you 3 examples of real people that have fictionalized themselves as an attempt to satire reality.
Nice to meet you, Nathan.
How are you? Court.
Oh. Door City over here.
Yes. This is basically, it's like a portal, I guess, in some levels.
Yeah.
The Rehearsal is a show that satirizes the traditional presentation of reality TV. Created by Nathan Fielder, in which he plays a fictionalized version of himself who is a reality television host, the show is about him helping people rehearse for anxious or uncertain personal conversations in a very ridiculous way. He has them go through rigorous trials of conversation with an actor in an identical copy of the location they're planning to meet in for the real deal, accounting for every possible response and reaction. All while Nathan helps people, he also uses the method for himself as a means to deal with his crippling social anxiety and his struggle to hold conversation. Even his narration is comically awkward in his dry and monotone explanation of his absurd ideas and updates on his current progress. But a lot of what makes the show funny is in the situational cringe comedy. You're constantly tortured with socially awkward situations that are characterized by Nathan's general obliviousness in conversation.
I made a show called Nathan For You.
Oh, okay.
Didn't you say your trivia specialty is television?
It is, but
shows?
there's even a limitation on that.
Oh, okay.
He has no self-awareness or social skills, which can be easily explained by his vice that is literally rehearsing all of his social interactions. If he's unwilling to practice making conversation without certainty, then he'll never develop any real social skills. I think the most clear and effective execution of this concept is found in the first episode. And what's interesting is that it is distinctly different from the rest of the episodes, since starting with episode 2, the show begins to focus on a through-line plot. I wasn't personally much of a fan of this choice, but my focus will be on just the first episode anyway. In the episode, Nathan helps out a man named Core who has something that's been weighing on him for a long time. He told a good friend of his when they met that he had earned his master's degree when in reality, he had only earned his bachelor's. Given the context, it seems like a pretty trivial lie, but it's something that could easily make someone like Core afraid to come clean. It's a simple dilemma. He wants to get it off his chest, and he's worried that in doing so he might hurt his friend and ruin their friendship. But having kept it to himself for so long has raised the perceived stakes while causing it to eat away at him even more. It's a simple and believable narrative for the premise of the show to be established with, and it's also a very effective way to show how Nathan deals with meeting new people. After he meets Core, he explains that he had used his rehearsal method for the very conversation they had just had. It's revealed in a very traditional reality television style, but it's clearly ridiculous and just part of the story. Or is it? The deeper you dive into the production of the show, the harder it becomes to tell what's real and what isn't. It's part of what makes the show special. The answer to is it real or fake is not easy to definitively answer, but this does not change the fact that, simply put, it is a story, and I will continue to analyze it as such. Now, the scene I had brought up is very funny to watch, but there's a genuinely interesting underlying thought that this presents. What if you could go into every single conversation prepared for anything the other person might say? We see that Nathan's rehearsal method clearly worked and has made it much easier for him to speak with Core. But this isn't entirely unlike what most people do anyway. When we know we're going to have a conversation with someone and we have time to mentally prepare for it, I'm sure we all at first come up with something we might want to start the conversation with, and vaguely think of a few directions it could go in. The rehearsal method is fundamentally relatable since it's an exaggeration of an idea we're all already familiar with, the idea of stressing over a social interaction. By opting for the rehearsal method, Nathan admits defeat in conversing with Core and forming any meaningful acquaintanceship with him. Almost every single time Nathan interacts with him, there's something that he had first planned. When Core explains that he's unwilling to risk losing the trivia at the bar he plans to meet his friend at, as trivia is very important to him, Nathan decides to gain access to the upcoming trivia questions and go on morning walks every day with Core to slowly plant the answers into his mind. If Nathan doesn't plan for anything to happen, then there's otherwise some ulterior motive. Like when they go clay pigeon shooting and he fills their rifles with blanks without telling Core so that they can bond over being bad at it. The main difference between these two is that Nathan needs the rehearsal method because he's afraid of meeting new people, and Core wants the rehearsal method because he's afraid of messing up a conversation with somebody he already has a connection with. The difference is that Nathan struggles with making human connections while Core struggles with maintaining them. This division that feels like a sort of disconnect between them creates this subtle tension that makes it all the more compelling when the end of the episode is left with some ambiguity. And of course what I mean by that is that the episode ends with Nathan talking to Core and he reveals to him that he had given him the trivia answers. But then it cuts to fake Core, who has a very viscerally negative reaction.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate your motivation, but you've tainted, you ruined the whole thing for me, because I knew the answers, and I'm on TV now, and everybody now is gonna think that I didn't know them and that I'm a fake, and you know how important this was for me. It's a mistake. It was a huge mistake. You fucked this all up. You're an awful, awful person.
I think you're a great guy. Like you're a great person.
Well, thank you for the compliment.
I think this is such a fascinating way to end the episode. You're left wondering, did Nathan really tell Core his secret? You really can look at it either way. The way real Core acts after the scene switches back to him could be perceived as hurt and angry, but his general attitude toward Nathan is very neutral, so it could also be perceived as him just being polite and accepting the compliment, since he only sees his relationship to Nathan as almost purely professional. And just the fact that there's a possibility Nathan may have decided not to tell real Core his secret really emphasizes the power of the rehearsal method overall. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a huge fan of the direction taken by the rest of the episodes in the show. This is in part because of how conclusive the first one is. In my opinion, it doesn't really lend itself to being part of a larger series. It feels perfectly well contained. But before the rehearsal, Nathan Fielder had created a show called Nathan for You. Nathan for You is a similar type of show. It mimics reality TV, but it is to be expected that a good amount of it is fake. In the show, Nathan plays a different fictionalized version of himself who allegedly graduated one of Canada's top business schools with really good grades, and he helps out small business owners with what he believes are clever and innovative marketing strategies, but are actually ridiculous ideas that hardly last very long. But every time, he considers it a victory when he gets the business owner to admit it was a success on some outrageous technicality he comes up with. The show generally focuses on one or two businesses per episode, all the while Nathan narrates explaining his ideas with a familiar, monotone cadence. And much like in the rehearsal, a recurring theme is his social awkwardness, creating a prominent sense of cringe comedy.
Angel.
Angel, your name?
Yes.
Why do you have that name?
Because my mother gave it to me.
Nathan for You is a show that so purely captures the zeitgeist of 2000s reality slop while still remaining satirical toward it. I mentioned that the rehearsal satirizes it in a similar way, but Nathan For You focuses specifically on that much more. It represents the end of an era, the era of reality television's dominance. What it makes you realize is that anything that happens in a reality TV show could be fake. Because from just watching Nathan For You, you can't definitively tell what's real and what isn't, yet you aren't invited to necessarily believe anything you're shown. In traditional reality shows, it's easy to forget that much of what happens in them is fake or dramatized. But Nathan For You is somewhat deliberating in the sense that it shows you that reality TV doesn't really teach you anything new most of the time, despite the name of the genre. You can typically rest assured, however, that documentary-style television is based mostly upon reality. But what about when documentary meets fiction? Joe Pera Talks With You is a very uniquely comforting show. Similarly to The Rehearsal, Joe Pera is a real-life comedian who plays a fictionalized version of himself in the show. The character he plays is a gentle, kind-hearted man who speaks slowly and softly to the viewer, almost like the host of a children's program. But the show portrays some more adult topics and sometimes dives into heavier thoughts like loss and grievance. Joe's character seems very mundane, almost absurdly so. He often explains niche and unremarkable facts and historical topics in a very plain and dry way. You could even say he's a boring guy, but in a very endearing way. It's kind of adorable how passionate and excited he is about his nerdy interests and the way he likes to spend his time. In the episode Joe Pera Takes You on a Fall Drive, he can't make it a few seconds without explaining the innovative engineering of his 2001 Buick Park Avenue. It's not exactly something that would pique anyone's interest, but there's something fun in just listening to him talk about whatever. The same episode is also a good example of the show's aesthetic. It has this relaxing and nostalgic autumn vibe, but this alters throughout the series depending on the season, and it only makes the show all the more comforting. Something that's very heartwarming is Joe's relations to the other characters. His friendliness highlights the small-town vibe the show has, in which almost all the other characters love Joe, and only very few don't. The plots that follow the side characters are all really well done and genuinely interesting, like with the Melsky family, for example. Through Joe interacting with them, we see peripheral insights into Sue and Mike's seemingly dysfunctional marriage as the tension between them slowly builds, and you wonder whether or not they'll be able to make amends. In some episodes, Mike invites Joe to hang out with him and his friends, but the dissonant contrast between their personalities usually results in Joe feeling out of place. He's not exactly your average 30-year-old man, which is why he typically spends time with his friend Gene, who shares his calm attitude and general interest in the mundane. Even Gene's side plot is interesting to see, with a focus put on his strained relationship with his two sons. And it's here that we begin to notice one of the show's strongest thematics: the emphasis put on the importance of family and community. The show is constantly introducing you to the people in Joe's life, all of whom are clearly very important to him, and it builds a really strong sense of that community that the characters thrive on. At its core, Joe Pera Talks With You is a comedy, the style of humor being deadpan, which works really well with the aesthetics and presentation of the show. Joe speaks in pretty much the same way every time he says something, and when he says something ridiculous in the same slow, monotone cadence as when he's explaining the importance of iron, it's really funny. The fact that he comes across as boring is another important aspect to it, but not in the sense that it makes him uninteresting. He has niche tastes and a distinct personality, but his routine and level of energy is generally very cut and dry. In essence, Joe's inability to display enthusiasm when necessary has unique comedic value. The style of humor in the show is actually quite similar to The Rehearsal, but Nathan Fielder's character achieves this in a different way. Joe's character has lovable and defining characteristics while remaining ultimately mundane and boring, but Nathan's character genuinely doesn't have much going for him. He's a blank slate in terms of personality. His boring demeanor and narration accurately represent who he is as a person. If anything, it makes his social anxiety easier to relate to because there's nothing that truly sticks out to distract from it. In essence, the humor in Joe Pera Talks With You is deadpan comedy, while the humor in The Rehearsal is cringe comedy. These two styles of humor have distinct differences, yet they exist in a very similar realm. But what about a show that merges these two styles and attempts to utilize the best of both worlds? Louie is another show about a generally normal guy. It was created by Louis C.K., a comedian who, much like Nathan Fielder and Joe Pera, plays a fictionalized version of himself in the show. His life is in the middle of the road. It's not too great, but it's certainly not bad either. Most of the show is about Louie finding himself in awkward and ridiculous situations while going about his day. While these situations are often ridiculous, he sometimes has genuinely insightful conversations in these unexpected encounters. At the beginning of the series, we learn that he's recently divorced after 14 years with half custody of his 2 young daughters who appear to be his biggest motivation in life. He's at his most miserable in weeks when he's without his kids, and he's mentioned his suicidal ideation about when they grow up and will no longer need him. There are plenty of depressing things that are prevalent in his life, but he never really complains. He's a generally good guy. He doesn't really come across as a loser, but he also never seems particularly confident. He just seems average, almost plain and boring. But there's a place where he takes on a completely different personality. Despite how normal his life is otherwise, he's a successful comedian. When he's on stage, he's bold and charismatic and really funny. Every joke lands. He's clearly very good at stand-up comedy, and we're shown this in a very unique way. We see clips of his day and what's going on in his life, but weaved between are clips of his stand-up jokes that are usually thematically relevant to the story told in the episode. Those stand-up clips really were performed by him, since he's a real comedian. This presentation makes Louie a very unique show, and like I said earlier, the humor is achieved similarly to both the Rehearsal and Joe Pera Talks With You. Louie isn't socially awkward like Nathan Fielder's character, but he does struggle with his dating life, which is a recurring thing we're shown throughout the series. As a middle-aged divorced man, nobody has any hope that he'll ever find love again. Every single time he goes on a date with someone, it really seems like they're hitting it off and that Louie might have finally found a new partner, but then there's some frustrating deal breaker that completely destroys that idea. At the same time, Louie isn't mundanely weird like Joe Pera's character, but his deadpan reactions to painfully cringeworthy moments are a big part of the humor in the show. Louie also takes on a boring persona in a different way. He's a somewhat depressing character, not in the sense that you constantly feel horrible for him, but in the sense that there's this bleak undertone to his life. Rather than being a boring guy purely because of his mundanity, he's a boring guy because of the slight air of depression you feel from watching the show. It is for this reason that I think Louie, in a way, embodies the essence of both Nathan Fielder and Joe Pera. Where isolation and numb simplicity meet, we find his character. But what exactly is the importance of these characters? Well, I don't think the point is that they hold some timeless significance, but rather that they allow their creators to express exaggerated versions of themselves through experimentation. I would certainly describe these shows as experimental, or at the very least unique. Since they play fictionalized versions of themselves, it's personal to them, but the characters are still relatable in many ways. With Nathan's character, you can relate to his social anxiety. With Joe's character, you can relate to his passion for niche interests and appreciation of simplicity. And with Louie's character, you can relate to the fact that sometimes life is just ridiculous. Though these characters don't necessarily serve as perfect representations of the comedians who exaggerated themselves. Nathan and Joe's characters are clearly heavily exaggerated. They remain in character in things like genuine interviews, but Louie's character seems to be more or less generally similar to himself in real life, which works well for the style of humor in comparison to the Rehearsal and Joe Pera. The humor in those shows is mostly driven by the main characters themselves and their exaggerated personas, whereas the humor in Louie is mostly driven by the world around him. Part of the endearment of these shows comes from how realistic they are, not only because of the good writing and acting, but because they can genuinely confuse you as to whether or not they're real or fictitious. And perhaps you realize that the answer may not be quite so black and white. The blurring of this line only serves to make you feel all the more attached to these shows in a certain way that other stories can't replicate in the same way, because it's something truly special when an attempt is made to fictionalize reality.